aptrgangr, the revenants, are different from the Haukboar for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think these aptrgangr, the revenants, I don't think they appear in other sagas other than the sagas of the Icelanders, where you're always going to find them in reference to some kind of haunting. Reimleikr is the term. So they haunt either their former household or some people in a territory, in a district, and so on and so forth. And another difference is that they rather act in darkness during wintertime, and the mound-dwellers are also active during spring and summer, which is actually the time where when people actually could organize expeditions to their burial mound to steal their stuff, or to sleep on the burial mound, to get some kind of a gift or knowledge or whatever. So in the sense, you can consider the Haugboar as being the one haunted. If you think about it, they are haunted by the living. They are the others, and as we have seen, more often than the case, they were compelled to act defensively, and they also appeared in dreams in order to prevent an intrusion. And when the intrusions took place, they had no alternative but to defend their own dwelling. On the other hand, the aptrgangr are pretty active in haunting the living and haunting their houses, and we have some very interesting examples. In Laxdœla saga, we have the character called Hrapr. He is a man from the Hebrides, so he is a stranger, a foreigner. He emigrated to Iceland because he was a violent man and because that got him into some kind of trouble. In Iceland, he establishes on his own himself on his own farm, and when he does that, he starts terrorizing his neighbors until old age confined him to his bed. And then when he feels like he's about to die, he calls his wife and tells her that he wants to be buried below the kitchen's door. And he is buried as instructed, and he wants to watch over his house. That's the explanation he's offering, and he begins to cause a lot of trouble after doing that. In his own farm, he is a little more aggressive, but the neighbors also get all kinds of trouble because of him. So in this case, they resort to a local chieftain, a local Gothi, and this chieftain goes to the farm in order to purify it and move Hrapr's body. And they actually do that. So that is the first solution offered to this problem of the haunting. The local chieftain moves the body, and then his haunting seems to decrease. This is also a reason for which his son settles on the farm afterwards, but the story tells us that soon afterwards he becomes crazy and dies. And then again, the farm becomes deserted until there is this guy, Olav, settling in the deserted farm because it was at an extremely low price and the land was very good. So that was a good deal, although the farm was haunted. And he received some complaints from his shepherds, actually, because the shepherd says, one of the shepherds says that he cannot go on with his work because Hrap stands in the barn doors and wants to hide from me, but I am sitting on the doorstep with him. So he is very scared because of this occurrence. And I think it's also relevant that we find this idea of the door being, again, some kind of liminal space where the revenant can move between worlds, something like that. And the shepherd asks for his master's help. Oliver, at the beginning, he doesn't understand why he refuses to do his job, but then he eventually goes with him to the cowshed that night, and he engages in a combat with this Hrapr character, pointing his spear at him. But then Hrapr breaks it in two and keeps the blade. That's also very interesting. So he wants it for himself. Then Olav intends to wrestle him, but he sinks in the ground. Also, an element you are going to find often in the sagas. So what they do next morning is that they go to where Hrapr is buried and they dig him out, and they find his body not decomposed, but very ugly and heavy, and appears to be a body that appeared to have been stronger and larger than in life. And they also find the spearhead that Hrapr took with him. And their decision is to actually burn him. So what we can find here in the story is this pattern of the malevolent character in lifetime transferring his personality after death, and you can also find this motif of the transformation of the body. Of course, after death, the body does suffer all kinds of transformations, but in this kind of perception of the dead, the body's transformation also points out to a kind of transformation in the personality of the character after death. So not only the shape, but also the little sense that remains after death. Um, the other character I would like to discuss is Thorolfur from Eyrbyggja saga. This is probably the most compelling of them all, the most compelling revenant, because of what he does and because of what happens after he dies. Because he dies in rage. That's also an important element that you're going to find. People dying in rage having a higher chance of becoming revenants. So you have this, again, foreigner. I call him foreigner because he's not among the first settlers. So if you're not among the first settlers, you would have been up to a certain point considered at least partially a foreigner. So you have this guy Thorolfur who dies in the middle of an anger display. And also, it's very interesting that he died while discussing some issues about his property and dragging some boundaries between lands. All right, and then he is found dead in the morning in the same position, and the household was absolutely terrified when finding him like that, because they were absolutely sure that he would actually become a revenant, and they want to take precautions for that not to happen. And it's very interesting what they do to do that, because when they prepare to bury him, they actually don't want the body to go through the front door, because if Thorolfur goes through the front door, he will remember the way back to the household and he will come to haunt them. So they decide to break the wall and to take the body through the hole in the wall. What they also notice is the fact that when they use oxen to drag his body, these oxen get extremely exhausted and they end up dead. The precaution measure doesn't really help, because Thorolf comes back and he starts haunting pretty much everything in his path during autumn time. He does that with the shepherds at first, and for example, one of the shepherds is found with his bones all broken, and what they do is that they actually bury this shepherd next to Thorolf. That's also very interesting, because it dwells on this idea that maybe such characters wanted something in their grave. Maybe they wanted some grave goods for themselves, and in this case, a servant. Why not? And then he proceeds with all the livestock in the valley, which is found dead. He also starts haunting his wife until she goes crazy and also dies. What they attempt to do is to move the body into a tall walled dais. This was also some kind of burial mound, but it was not as majestic. It was more like a cairn, so some stones put on a lump of earth. So there wasn't really the same honor in being buried in a dais compared to being buried in a haug, in a burial mound. Um, and again, his body is dragged in a sledge by some oxen who get exhausted, and then they have to replace them. And eventually, the oxen get crazy and die. And then this Thorolfur character lies in his new resting place until the death of his son. He does appear later after his son dies. He becomes active again and starts killing people again, cattle farms in the area which get deserted. And people set on an expedition to his grave and dig him out. And they see that he has become black, completely black, and also very uh, heavy and large, and he looks horrible, and they decide to burn his body. The story doesn't end here because even though his ashes are spread out at sea, his spirit, let's say spirit, is transferred to an ox, to the a bull called Glacier, who is also engaged in a killing afterwards. And this is very interesting in order to see the evolution of this revenant and also the measures people take against him and how persistent he was after death. I don't think I know of any revenant who was more persistent than Thorolf in terrorizing people after he becomes a aptrgangr. From these stories, we can wonder about why these people become revenants in the first place. Are there some kind of irregularities about their death, some kind of traits that become them prone to becoming an aptrgangr? And is dying in anger a reason for that? And also, what I suspect to be the case is this desire of possessing, of controlling, actually the force driving these people to act like this after they die. So if you read the stories, you're going to find something interesting, which is that these aptrgangr were not really among the first settlers in Iceland, or they were people of lower conditions. For example, magicians. A magician was also seen as being somewhere on the border of normal society, like outcast, like an outcast. And this idea of being the other in society, I think it transfers a little bit to the conception of your personality after death, and to the way you act after you die, because you are still the other. You are the other during your lifetime, and you are the other during your death life at the same time. You will also see that the burial place of this aptrgangr is always or almost always a dis, so a cairn. It's not a haug, so the more elevated burial mound, and they don't really have any grave goods, which might be the reason why they are in search of such things. So they have this kind of dishonorable situation of being buried in this particular way, and they might have also been characters who have suffered some kind of difficulty during their lifetime acquiring some possession, some land or some goods, and so on. Maybe the fact that they don't react when people start digging them out to transfer them to another place, because they didn't really have anything valuable to protect, unlike the mound-dwellers who had great treasures to protect, as we have seen. Hrapper, if you think about it, starts haunting in order to prevent people from taking over his property. He kills the ones who try to take over his properties, so he prefers his property to remain abandoned than being taken by others. And he does the same when he appears again several years after, when his farm was taken over by another farmer. And something similar happens to Thorolf when he wants to control the valley he resided in at any cost, and he wants to control it so badly that even the birds at the contact with his grave actually die. There is also a difference in status here that needs to be remembered, because if everyone died in anger, then I think the whole body of literature would be full of revenants. But this doesn't really happen. As a counterexample, we have Skatlagrim from the famous saga of Egil, who actually doesn't turn into a revenant, although he also dies in anger, and people were actually afraid of him turning into a revenant, but that doesn't really play a part in it. So I suspect that in this case, well, especially of Thorolf and Hrapr, I discussed before, I suspect that this is a case of a mix of temperament, personality, and of economic factors. And to remember from this pattern, from this pattern of character, is the fact that they are extremely active outside of their graves, outside of their disyar, but they are actually passive when people confront them while they are in these graves. And there is, of course, a difference in motivation if you look at these stories, but at the same time, you're also going to find this common element of them trying to assert their dominance over a certain household or a valley or a district, and so on and so forth. And speaking of otherness, I mentioned before, I think that's the key of interpreting the aptrgangr here. We also have an aptrgangr in the saga of Grettis, the famous Glam. I say famous because of the curse he places on Grettir that will bring him his doom eventually, because he becomes an outlaw and he has to confront a lot of hardships in his life. And I find it interesting that this character is also foreign from many points of view. He is also foreign because he is Swedish, and he is also foreign because he's a godless shepherd, so he's not a believer as the saga describes him, and he also is of lower status. So the Swedish shepherd, when he is killed and his body is found, people tried to take his body to the church, but they noticed that he was so heavy that they couldn't move it that far. So this is also a common element, that the body cannot be moved, or that the oxen become exhausted when attempting to do that. He was buried in Adis as well, and Glam becomes an aptrgangr a few days afterwards, and among his first activities were to ride the roof of the house at night. This is also a common motif, riding either the house or even riding people in the sense of trying to possess them. That's also a pretty common element in these stories. In his place, another shepherd gets the job. Everybody liked him because this time he was a Christian. And when winter came and Glam killed him, they actually had no trouble transporting him and burying him in the churchyard. This is in order to see the contrast between the two characters, or the two types of characters. What he does next is to kill the cowherd, and then he does the same in the neighboring farms, and then he proceeds with killing horses and dogs in the neighboring farms. At some point he stops, but then he starts again. He also has some activity in the summer, but in the autumn is when he actually makes his most dreadful appearance. Then Grettir, the hero, arrives to the farm, and Glom kills his horse. The next night, Glom goes into the house and they start wrestling. Grettir tries to drag him out, which he finally does, and he eventually wins the fight. He cuts Glam's head and puts it between his legs. That's an interesting piece of detail. And then he is burnt and his ashes are cast away, far away. But like I said before being killed, Glam speaks a very long curse that will prove to be fundamental in Grettir's story. This attempt to locate this type of draugr among the less fortunate elements of society, you can also find reflected in other stories. You have the story of Thormund, for example, Horvardar saga Isfirðings, where he is described as being some kind of outcast, and then being probably a sorcerer as well. One day he dies and his widow asks for help because he keeps on scaring the farm hands, so they wanted to leave the farm. And then you have Olaf trying to help her, and he attacks him with his axe, but then they begin to wrestle, and eventually Olaf ends up breaking his back, and then he carries his body until he finds a point where the water is deep enough, and he sinks him. Getting rid of the body is also a common topic in these stories. So, generally speaking, you have several steps to be taken in order to get rid of a revenant. Reburying, burning, and spreading the ashes into the sea are the most common ones, although you are also going to find a lot of diversity in the stories. For example, I offered here the Flomana saga, where you have actually two cases where the hero Thorgils deals with the revenant haunting a farm, and then with the mother of his friend herself. And the second case is more interesting because the saga describes that this friend asked Thorgils to go with him to bury his mother because all of the farmhands wanted to leave the place. Because of her haunting, and the woman was prepared a coffin, and Thorgils asked for strong ropes, but then they couldn't deal with the coffin, and the ropes broke, and the woman got out of the coffin. So their decision, and she started actually moving. They could barely deal with her, and eventually they ended up burning her on a pyre. And everyone was happy. And a lot of other examples in Laxdœla saga, for example, you have a wizard who is drowned. In Grettir sagas, we have seen you have Glam who gets decapitated and then burnt. And in Erbygja saga, you have Thorolf who is still a revenant despite his ashes being cast at sea. And in Laxdœla saga, you have Hrapr who gets reburied and burnt, and the only resistance is actually from the body itself when it's moved. Now, you may wonder, with all this stuff going on, why didn't people use it as a prevention measure? Well, I suspect that would have been quite the dishonorable thing to do. And we actually have reference to that in laws such as the Gulathing law. In saga literature as well, the bodies of those who are obviously on their way on becoming an aptrgangr are never decapitated before burial. And even if they were sorcerers, they might not have wanted to dishonor the body and set a reaction on the part of the relatives to avenge. The problem of cremation is also interesting. We do know that pre-Christian Scandinavian burial practices included both cremation and inhumation. And we also know that cultures that cremate tend to not have revenants in corporeal form. So, in this sense, Scandinavia is a particular case because cremation and burial coexisted a long period of time. In sagas, cremation was reserved exclusively for these aptrgangr, so for these revenants. This appears to be, in this sense, an Icelandic phenomenon. Inhumation graves were actually commonplace, universal in Iceland. They were common in Scandinavia, but in Iceland they were universal. So cremation wasn't really practiced. This might have to do something with why cremation was seen as the better practice to deal with these creatures, because it might have led, with the passage of time, to the belief that the dead could be dangerous. The aptrgangr stories are not invulnerable to Christian influence. Some of them retain some native elements, other have been mixed with Catholic ghost folklore, and this you can see in stories such as the one told in Flomana saga, when you have some people lost in an excursion and stranded in Greenland. Some of them were pagan, and when Christmas arrived, the Christian leader of the expedition commanded the crew to remain quiet and to go to bed and keep their faith. And the pagan men, on the other hand, did a lot of noise and they did not respect any rules. And soon after, they ended up dead and they became revenants. Speaking of paganism versus Christianity and that kind of thing, I think this idea of reburying, burning, and spreading the ashes into the sea can also be linked to an interesting passage from the Ynglinga saga. This is the saga written by Snorri at the beginning of his cycle on the history of the kings of Norway, where he talks about Odin and Odin's affairs, properties, and so on. And this is actually consistent with the recommendation Odin makes in order to be properly buried. So this might have had something to do with with the fact that if you were a pagan, you needed to be you know, reburied and burnt and with your ashes spread like in the pagan way, like in the old way, in order to keep you from this world. I suspect this might also have been the case, because we can see that pagan versus Christian also played a part in the stories about aptrgangr. Now, I talked a lot about the difference between Haukbui or Haukbuar and aptrgangr, but I also must mention the fact that sometimes this difference is blurred, because Kor, I mentioned before from Grettis saga, is both a mound-dweller and an aptrgangr, and this might have to do with his particular case. So he basically haunts the whole territory of the Horamarsei in order to ensure a bigger property for his son. So even though there are ways of of drawing a difference between these creatures, we also need to remember that if we try to classify them in a true strict of a way, we're kind of missing a lot of the point of these old beliefs that can be retrieved in a certain way from saga literature as well. So some of them, I don't think that they can also be they can only be considered motifs in saga literature. I think that if we are careful enough, we can actually at least select the ones who are most likely to have been around in one way or another in the old times as well, so in pre-Christian times. As a conclusion to the aptrgangr, remember that they are the ones acting violently and aggressively, and they are the ones engaging in haunting and wanting to assert their dominance and control over a territory or a household, and they rather show a problematic position during a lifetime in society. So they were considered to be the others, and this otherness might have been transferred to the afterlife as well. Another interesting idea I found in some articles written by researchers Kirsi Kaneva is the idea of this revenant in Icelandic sagas actually having a social function, in the sense that when you engage with the undead, this can also be interpreted as a way to renegotiate your problematic social status. And this is due to the fact that a lot of the heroes who engage with these characters also suffer some kind of deprivation, some kind of problematic social status, and the status can be then reinterpreted and renegotiated, so they no longer are outcasts. And I'm just going to give a few examples. We have Kjartan in, again, Erbiga saga, which is an extraordinary saga. I really recommend if you're into this kind of stuff, magic, sorcerers, supernatural, and so on and so forth. It's full of it. So this hero, Kjartan, deals with a group of restless dead. There are 18 members of the family, and they continually harass those living on a farm called Froða. And the restlessness seems to be connected to a woman from the Hebrides called Thorgunna. Again, you can see this otherness manifested in the story as well. And she dies of disease, and her bedclothes are not burnt, and that might be the cause of it all. And Kjartan finds a way of dealing with this problem, and he has the bedclothes of Thorgunna burned, and then he also brings a priest, his uncle, helps him with. He holds masses, and there are also confessions and purifications of the place going on with holy water and so on. And what's most interesting is the fact that Kjartan, together with his uncle's son, actually summons the restless to a door court, in which it is stated that they don't belong there anymore and they should disappear, which they actually do. So I don't really know how to classify um, this revenant. It is an aptrgangr, but then the way Kjartan gets rid of them doesn't really correspond to the patterns we have discussed. But anyway, Kjartan is more important in this example, because Kjartan is also a hero with a problematic status, because he has been born out of a relationship that was not accepted by his maternal relatives. He was the fruit of a forbidden love between his mother, who was also the sister of the chieftain Snorri, and some guy named Bjorn who doesn't want to acknowledge him as his son. And in the way he acts when these harassments take place, by asking for the help of his maternal relatives, he becomes accepted by the family, and there is also a symbolic acknowledgement taking place some years after these wonders of Froda, as they are called, when he actually receives a sword from his father as a gift. And in this moment, also with the help of this ghost story, he actually becomes accepted in society. Then we have the case of Olaf in Laxdœla saga. He settles on a farm he received from his father, and the earlier owner of the place, Hrapr, I discussed earlier, starts walking restlessly on the farm after his death, and they have this confrontation on the doorway. And he strikes him with a spear, digs up the corpse, and burns it. Olaf is interesting in the story because he's also the product of an unapproved sexual relationship. In this case, he is the son of a concubine. His mother is Melkorka, who is a concubine, but she's actually the daughter of an Irish king. And as an adult, Olaf actually goes to visit his grandfather in order to rediscover his roots. And this episode with the Revenant Hrapr actually takes place after his trip. And like Kjartan, he's also born out of a relationship that wasn't really approved by society. So we have not only the Revenant being situated in this liminal space in between worlds, we also have the characters who deal with them actually belonging to a liminal space, to a place which is uncertain in society. And the Restless Dead seem to offer both Kjartan and Olaf a possibility to renegotiate the social status in order for them to be accepted in society. This is also the case of Grettir. His story, however, doesn't really end up well. So he enters the mound of this character Glam I mentioned before in the course of a trip he makes to Norway, and there he fights the restless dead, but he does so out of his own free will, not because this dead guy was haunting anyone. However, he manages to defeat him, and what's interesting about Grettir is the fact that he also has a troubled relationship to his father that can also be a reflection, or can be reflected in the way he deals with these undead or hybrids, monsters, whatever you want to call them. So Grettir wants to get ahead of himself. He wants to cope. He wants to get famous because he isn't really acknowledged either. He leaves his home with not much. His father doesn't really provide his son with the necessary equipment, such as weapons. He only gets from him a minor piece of property. Nevertheless, in the case of Grettir, at least, he is originally a member of an important and respected family of landowners. However, without the active support of his father, he does seem to be a product of misfortune as well. And this misfortune is reflected in the curse Glam puts on Grettir. It's no wonder that you wanted to meet me, Grettir, but it was a mistake for you to do that. I know that you are going to become mightier, that you are now, and but nevertheless, you are going to be involved in a lot of ill doings and manslayings, and for most part of those things, you will have to pay, in the sense that he would eventually become an outlaw, and by becoming an outlaw, that was actually the worst thing you could have become, because that gave other people the right to kill you and not to suffer a trial afterwards. So this glamour is interesting because he speaks a curse, which is not something that happens frequently, but then the saga describes Glamour as being a special kind of aptrgangr. So he's also between a mound-dweller and an aptrgangr from this point of view. But Grettir also has a pretty problematic status. Thorgils, I mentioned before, who is also confronted with two revenants or two types of revenants, is also having all kinds of problems. He is informed that the people are afraid of Bjorn's father. In the first example, has died recently and become restless. And after a battle, he manages to overpower the ghost, and then he has to deal with the mother of his friend, Audun. Interesting to see the fact that Thorgils also is a character of more or less problematic status, is that he receives a sword helping him to defeat a berserk, and this he obtains from Håkon Jarl, who actually is involved in why his father got in trouble in the first place, because his father was attempting to claim or protect some lands in Norway, and he didn't really come back. And eventually, Thorgils obtains from Håkon Jarl the lands his family had owned in Norway. So through his contacts with these two revenants, he also gets the chance to renegotiate his status, because he's also fatherless. He loses his father due to the aforementioned reasons. There are a lot of other examples where people have to deal with the undead, with unspecified undead. So not necessarily aptrgangr or haukbui, but all kinds of apparitions and ghosts, either complaining about something or offering a piece of advice, or just delivering a message. You will find, for example, in Laxdœla saga, you will find Gudrun, who is living on the Helgafell farm after changing dwelling places with the chieftain, and she sees her husband, who had drowned earlier on the same day when she arrives at the church. She also sees other men who also drowned with her husband, but she doesn't really interact with them at all. So she is given this chance to neglect these apparitions, and I think here you just have the idea of Christianity being able to offer some kind of protection in front of such apparitions. Another example would be in Eirik saga, where you have another character, Gudrid, also a Christian woman. She marries a man called Thorstein, but then unfortunately during winter a serious disease kills several people on the farm, including Thorstein, and after his death he appears to another woman who has fallen ill, and she's also found dead. So that kind of occurrences. Then in a night, Gudrid's husband rises to a sitting position and wants to see his wife, and he actually does that only to make a prophecy about her keeping her true faith, and remarrying, and being blessed. So there isn't really any negative interaction at all. A mix of blessing and also assertion of authority you will find in Grænlendinga saga, where there is a similar story also involving this character, but at the same time her husband appears to her after she starts finding comfort in the arms of another man, and the deceased husband declares his words. He states that he does want to make his death easier for Gudrid. He also prophesizes that she is going to live a good and blessed life. But at the same time, it's interesting to notice the moment when he appeared. So when she was trying to find comfort somewhere else. Right, and coming back to Gunnar, we mentioned at the very beginning, this character doesn't really suggest that he would become restless, although his killing is not settled in court, so that could make us wonder, maybe to require to require his vengeance, to settle things straight. Maybe in this sense he could become a revenant, but no, he doesn't. In this, on the contrary, he actually is a generous spirit, and he only wants to support his son Högni, because in a way he knows that he is going to be avenged by his son. So you can interpret it both as a prophecy and as some kind of support for his son. And in the case of the dead poet, we also mentioned at the beginning. Well, here you can also find this idea of an undead character actually providing positive traits, helpful traits. In this case, the gift of poetry. So you can see there is really a great diversity of examples. And again, if you want, you can classify in at least two categories. A lot of the characters in the sagas, in aptrgangr and Haukboar, but then again, there is this very large category of undead, which can't really be classified, and who are involved in all kinds of apparitions, from a good prophecy to asserting dominance or requesting vengeance, and so on and so forth. So my point with this aspect was the fact that the conflicts of the restless dead become involved in are actually both social and psychological. And I would say that in older sagas, you have this idea of the conflict being actually in the area of a community, so a broadened conflict comprising a whole community or territory. But these conflicts in later sources, they tend to be more individualized. So they tend to refer to the relationship between a certain character and, his problematic family, and that conflict is transferred to the relationship that character has with some kind of undead. So revenants, beings with malevolent intentions, as we have seen in the case of aptrgangr, or as beings with some helpful traits if you go through more of the saga material.